In this video, the third in our series, we're going to talk about reframing through a lens of compassion. So let's get started. So let's take a minute to think about what a compassion-driven life looks like. We've heard a lot about a purpose-driven life, finding meaning and value in life, and of course these things are all important, but if you think about it, finding my purpose is a very self-focused task. So my purpose could be to travel all around the world. My purpose could be to learn to make jewelry. And all of those are valuable and they provide meaning in my life, but they don't necessarily involve other people making the world a better place. They involve me. So how would a compassion-driven life look differently? What would it mean to you? And I would like to ask you, just take a minute to think and reflect. We talked in the 7 virtues about the importance of patience and mindfulness and reflection. And so think about what a compassion-driven life would look like. Would your life be different if compassion were front and center? If you looked at the world through colored glasses and the color of the glasses was compassion? So let's think about how we can experience the world through a lens of compassion. And I'm going to suggest 3 steps, and we'll talk a little bit about them. The first is to declutter your life. The second is to set your intention. And the third is now to engage in reframing your experience. So let's start talking about decluttering your life. Decluttering your life will allow you to make space for compassion. So think about clutter in your life. Is your space cluttered? Is your day cluttered with activities? Is your email cluttered with all kinds of messages? Is your mind cluttered with too much stimulation and too many thoughts? What's wrong with clutter? It takes up space in our physical world, in our mental world, in our emotional world, and it takes up space that we could be using for compassion instead of confusion. So how can you declutter? Well, you can start with your space. Look around you. Are there too many things in your environment? Is your environment cluttered? Do you need all the things around you? Are they diverting your view so that you don't focus on any one thing? You focus on way too many things. And then take some time to be in outdoor space, in nature, in the environment. There's a lot of interesting work on what's called forest bathing, which is being out where you just absorb the beauty of the trees and the leaves and the sky. And these are things that anybody can have access to, more or less. But oftentimes, I know I like to hike a lot in the mountains, and I'm always amazed when I see people hiking, talking on the phone, listening to music, and texting. And I think to myself, talk about cluttering your space. You're in this beautiful environment with nature all around you, and yet you're cluttering it with your attention focused on so many things other than the beauty all around you. So start with your space. You can also reduce multiple stimulating events so that you're not trying to, we used to say multitasking, now it's quadruple tasking. People are always trying to do so many things at once rather than focus on and pay attention to just one thing. Well, if your mind does wander, you're like most people. In fact, if we look at the research on mind wandering, people report that their minds wander about 50% of the time. It appears to be our default mode. It allows us to multitask, but it's also a source of unhappiness. And it typically involves self-focused thinking about I and me. And one easy strategy to settle our minds that we've talked about in the 7 virtues around patience and being in the moment is being mindful. And it's very important to declutter your own internal space in your mind and think of strategies to minimize your mind wandering. The second step to experience the world through a lens of compassion is to make a commitment to compassion, to become knowledgeable about compassion. We invite you to watch all of the videos in our series and to participate in some of the lectures and programs in Compassion University. And there are also many websites and trainings you can attend to find out more about compassion and how to cultivate it. And then the third step in viewing the world through a lens of compassion really involves how do we reframe experiences, and particularly how do we reframe negative experience, and how we experience and understand an event completely influences our reaction to it. Reframing is particularly important when we talk about negative or destructive thoughts. And what makes a thought negative or destructive? Well, some characteristics of negative thoughts are they're backwards looking rather than forwards looking. We mentioned that if I look at failure and dwell on it, it's already happened. It's not going to be helpful to keep dwelling on the past. They tend to focus on a person's characteristics rather than a behavior. This is a bad person rather than this person did a bad thing. They tend to be hopeless instead of hopeful. So there are a lot of characteristics of negative and destructive thoughts. Think about in your own life. Do you have a lot of negative and destructive thoughts? And what are some of those negative and destructive thoughts? One of the things that's important to recognize about reframing is that it's difficult and it takes time. And we talked about the importance of patience. Very interesting, in Buddhist scriptures, they mention 84,000 negative and destructive thoughts that we can have. That's a lot to overcome. I hope you don't have 84,000. I don't think I do have 84,000 either. But let's take an example of anger, because that's probably the negative and destructive thought that we all share. And let's think about how we might reframe it. Something that I've studied in my work on aggression is the importance of interpretation of ambiguous events. So let me give you an example. If you're at a stoplight and the light turns green and someone honks their horn at you and they lay on their horn, how do you interpret that? You could interpret it by saying, oh, they're reminding me the light's green, I should go, because chances are I might be looking at my phone or texting or something. Or you could interpret it as, how dare they be so negative and forceful and honk at me and lay on their horn. And it's even more nuanced than that. If someone just did a little tap on the horn, you might be more likely to think, oh, they're reminding me the light's green. If they laid on the horn, you might think they're mad and they have no right to be mad. Just wait a second, the light just turned green. Slight nuances of an event would really, and how you interpret it, then will color your reaction. And in the field of aggression, we see a lot of times in ambiguous situations, more aggressive children overestimate hostility. I used to work with adolescents in high school settings, and it was always the famous dirty look. People would get in a fight and you'd say, what happened? And the answer would be, she gave me a dirty look, or he gave me a dirty look. And I would always say, how do you know it was a dirty look? Maybe they had something in their eye. But how we interpret, if you thought they had something in their eye, well, then you would interpret it differently. Usually if people apologize, it quickly diffuses it. When I've accidentally cut people off on the freeway in Southern California, which is a high-risk thing to do, the first thing I do is I say, sorry, and then it's fine, because I'm afraid if I don't, they're going to chase me, tailgate me, who knows what. But slight nuances can impact how people interpret it, but really the key point is how you interpret it impacts your reaction to it and whether or not you get angry. We tend to focus a lot on our own experience of an event, how it affects me, not what necessarily caused the other person to do it. And if you think about compassion as understanding our common humanity and involving perspective taking and empathy, it has to engage the bigger picture. We have to look at any interaction as there's two people or multiple people, not just my perspective of it. We tend to focus on the person and how dare that person do that, rather than why did he or she honk at me. We say that's an angry, mean person and I'm mad at the person. So I would challenge you in terms of when you're angry, and look, we all get angry, we're human. How can you refocus your anger and reframe your anger to try to at least understand the other person's perspective? Are they suffering? Do they think they're suffering? Obviously, the person who honks at you at the red when the light turns green thinks they're suffering because they have to wait 5 seconds till you go. But I think if you can really try to understand that there are other reasons behind what the person is doing that are probably related to something at the very least making them uncomfortable, unhappy, and suffering in some way, that will help you have a lens of compassion and be a little more understanding and maybe get a little less angry, because anger is not good for you. And anger, again, for me, people say, I tend to not get angry very much because anger is backward looking. If something happened that I'm not happy with, if I get angry about it, I'm not changing it. It already happened. It doesn't seem like a forward looking response. So I try to understand what happened. And it doesn't mean I say that's fine, go ahead and do it, or I just, don't think there should be any consequences. But I try to understand the big picture of the situation. And I try to think of, what would a compassionate lens help me understand about what happened, and then I can react in a calmer and more patient way. So the big question really that we've addressed in this video is, how can we reframe our experiences and our interpretation of our experiences to extend the benefits of compassion to all living things? And I want you to think about that for a minute. There's a Buddhist quote that I like to read from time to time, and it says, "Just as I desire happiness and wish to avoid suffering, the same is true of all other living beings. They too desire happiness and wish to avoid suffering." And it's really important to remember that, because we tend to be, obviously, we're much more in tune to our own suffering and how we feel. But if we acknowledge that nobody wants to, everybody does suffer, suffering is a part of life, nobody wants to suffer, and a compassion-driven life really helps us minimize at least the suffering, not only of ourselves, but of others.